The audience at The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon had been waiting for this moment all week. The studio was buzzing with energy, lights flashing as the camera crew made their final adjustments. The air felt thick with anticipation, and you could sense that tonight was going to be different. Jimmy Fallon, the ever-charismatic host of the show, stood backstage, chatting with the crew and making last-minute preparations. He was known for his quick wit, infectious energy, and ability to keep things light, but tonight there was an added excitement. The guest who was about to sit across from him wasn't just any Hollywood star. No, this was someone who had a reputation for being genuine, humble, and almost impossibly cool. Keanu Reeves was the guest. And if you had been paying attention to social media or any interviews with him over the years, you'd know that he wasn't the typical celebrity. He didn't seek attention or feed into the Hollywood spotlight. He kept to himself, lived a simple life, and was kind in ways that made fans adore him more with each passing day. But most importantly, Keanu had a reputation for being someone who always surprised people in the most unexpected ways. As Jimmy walked out onto the stage to the familiar applause and cheers, he couldn't help but smile. He loved his job, but there was something special about having Keanu Reeves in the building. He knew this wasn't going to be your average interview. In fact, he couldn't have predicted just how wild the night would get. The camera zoomed in on Jimmy as he stood by his desk, ready to kick off the show with his usual routine. He had a couple of funny jokes lined up to warm the crowd, and the audience knew they were in for some laughs. But there was an underlying sense of something more that made tonight feel different. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy said, his voice rising above the clapping. "I don't think I need to introduce this guy, but I will anyway. He's an absolute legend. You know him from The Matrix, John Wick, and just about every movie that's ever made you think, how is this guy so cool? Please welcome the one and only Keanu Reeves." The crowd erupted into applause, and the camera panned over to the man himself, standing just behind the curtain. Keanu smiled, waving to the audience as he made his way onto the stage. His calm demeanor instantly put everyone at ease. There was something about him that made you feel like you were sitting with a friend. Not a massive movie star, no flashy entrance, no over-the-top gestures, just Keanu, walking toward Jimmy with that familiar, humble smile. As Keanu took his seat across from Jimmy, the audience's excitement didn't die down. There was a special kind of energy in the room, something almost electric. Jimmy had interviewed plenty of stars before, but there was always a sense that this one was going to be different. The way Keanu looked at life, the way he talked about his experiences, always left people feeling like they'd just been part of something bigger than an ordinary interview. "So, Keanu, how's it going?" Jimmy began, his usual lightheartedness shining through. "It's so great to have you back on the show. You've been kind of laying low recently, huh?" Keanu gave a small, quiet laugh, shrugging his shoulders slightly. "Yeah, just taking it easy. I've been keeping busy in my own way, but I try to stay out of the spotlight." Jimmy nodded, not surprised by Keanu's answer. It was the same humble response he had always given. "Well, that's what we love about you. You're the most low-key superstar in Hollywood, and I think that's why people love you so much." The audience chuckled, and Jimmy continued. "But let's talk about your new project. I mean, come on. Everyone's been waiting for the next John Wick, right? I've got people in the crowd here who are practically losing their minds over that. Are you planning on taking a break anytime soon?" Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, giving Jimmy a thoughtful look. "Well, I don't know about taking a break," he said. "I just go where the work feels right. But I've always said, I don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over. I've been lucky to be part of some amazing projects, but I think it's important to always stay open to new ideas, new opportunities." That was the thing about Keanu. He didn't just talk about his work, he talked about it with a level of thoughtfulness that made you feel like you were hearing from someone who truly cared about what they did. It wasn't about the fame or the money. It was about the craft, the people you worked with, and the impact it had on the world. As the conversation went on, Jimmy asked Keanu a few more light questions about life on set, the craziness of fame, and his experiences working on some of his most iconic roles. The laughs kept coming, and the crowd was loving it. But there was one thing Jimmy couldn't shake. Something felt different about this interview. Keanu wasn't just giving his usual thoughtful answers. He was saying things that seemed even more profound, even more deep than what you might expect from a movie star. There was a quiet intensity to his words, a calm wisdom that hung in the air every time he spoke. And Jimmy, who had been in front of millions of people for years, found himself captivated by it. At one point, Jimmy asked, "What do you think is the most important thing we can do as people? What's the key to living a good life?" Keanu sat for a moment as if considering the question carefully. The silence stretched on for a few seconds, and you could feel the shift in the room. This wasn't just an actor talking about his favorite role. This was someone reflecting on life, offering something meaningful. Finally, Keanu spoke. "I think it's simple," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's about kindness. That's the key. Be kind to people. It's the simplest thing we can do, and it makes the biggest difference." Jimmy, who had been listening intently, leaned forward in his chair. There was something in the way Keanu said it, as if he truly believed it from the bottom of his heart. The crowd, sensing the depth of the moment, went quiet. It was almost like you could hear a pin drop. This wasn't the kind of response Jimmy had expected, and it certainly wasn't what he was used to getting from other guests. "Kindness?" Jimmy asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's it?" Keanu nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, that's it. It's easy to get caught up in everything else, the fame, the money, the success. But at the end of the day, it's about how we treat each other. That's what makes life meaningful." The words hung in the air, and Jimmy, for the first time in a long time, didn't immediately have a clever comeback. He was taken aback, not just by the simplicity of Keanu's answer, but by how powerful it was. The studio was still, and for a moment it felt like time had slowed down. The usual hustle and bustle of the show seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered was this quiet moment of reflection, shared between Jimmy and Keanu. Jimmy finally broke the silence, his voice softer than usual. "Wow, I wasn't expecting that. But I get it. I really do." The crowd, too, seemed to be absorbing what Keanu had said. People were nodding, thinking about how they could be a little kinder to those around them. It wasn't some grand speech or some life-changing revelation. It was just simple, honest advice from someone who seemed to have it all figured out in ways most people didn't. As the interview continued, the tone had shifted. The jokes and lighthearted banter were still there, but now there was a deeper sense of respect in the air. Jimmy had always admired Keanu for his humility, but now he realized there was more to him than just a good actor or a nice guy. There was a wisdom there, one that wasn't always obvious but was undeniable once you took a moment to listen. As the first part of the interview came to an end, Jimmy smiled, still processing what had just happened. He had asked Keanu a simple question, and Keanu had given him an answer that was anything but ordinary. It was a moment of clarity, one that would stay with him, and with everyone watching, long after the show ended. As the show carried on, the atmosphere in the studio seemed to shift. You could tell that Jimmy was still processing what Keanu had just said. The weight of the moment had settled over the room, and even though the laughter had returned, there was a quiet, almost reverent energy hanging in the air. Jimmy wasn't used to feeling like this during an interview. He was always the one who had the last word, the quick joke to break the tension, but this time, Keanu had left him with something more profound. Jimmy took a deep breath and tried to steer the conversation back to his usual fast-paced rhythm, but it wasn't quite as easy as it usually was. He gave Keanu a quick smile and leaned forward, as if he were about to ask a lighter question, something to bring the fun back into the mix. "So, Keanu," Jimmy began, his voice a little slower than usual, "you've always been known for being, well, kind of a mysterious guy. You don't really play into the whole celebrity thing, do you?" He gave a small laugh, trying to make light of it. Keanu smiled, that quiet smile of his, the one that made you feel like he was always one step ahead of everyone else. He had this way of making everything seem so simple, so effortless even when it wasn't. "Yeah, I guess I just don't really see the point," Keanu replied, his voice calm and steady. "I mean, people put a lot of weight on the whole celebrity thing. But at the end of the day, I'm just a person, you know?" Jimmy nodded, impressed by Keanu's humility, but still curious. "But you've had some pretty huge roles. I mean, The Matrix, John Wick, those are iconic. How do you stay grounded when everything around you is, well, kind of crazy?" Keanu paused for a moment as though considering how to respond. He leaned back in his chair, his hands resting loosely in his lap. "I think the key is just to remember what really matters," he said. "You know, we're all just here for a short time, and I think it's important to stay connected to the things that make life meaningful. Family, friends, Just being a good person. Fame doesn't change that. Jimmy chuckled softly, trying to keep the tone light. I think I could use a little of that wisdom. Sometimes it's hard to get away from all the noise, right? He gestured around the set, where the crew was busy making sure everything was in place. I mean, even in this place, it's all hustle and bustle. But you always seem to have this calm about you. Keanu's gaze softened and he nodded. I think it's about perspective. If you focus too much on all the chaos around you, you can lose sight of what's important. I try to stay focused on the people and things that matter. Everything else is just noise. The audience fell silent again, almost as if they too were absorbing what Keanu was saying. Jimmy, for a second, didn't know how to keep the conversation moving. It wasn't that he didn't want to keep chatting with Keanu, but there was something about his words that made everything else seem less important. It was like a sudden realization that maybe they were all too caught up in the rush of life, and Keanu had just given them a glimpse of a slower, more intentional way of living. It wasn't the first time Jimmy had heard someone talk about staying grounded. He'd had plenty of famous guests who preached about the importance of family, friends, and self-care. But there was something about Keanu's delivery, something about the way he said it that made it feel real, like he wasn't just repeating something he'd been told to say in interviews. Jimmy shook his head, a small grin spreading across his face. I don't know if I can do the calm thing as well as you, Keanu, but I'll try. Maybe I should take up yoga or something, he said with a playful tone, trying to lighten the mood a bit. The audience chuckled, and Keanu smiled in response. Yoga is a good start, he said simply without skipping a beat. It was then that Jimmy decided to take the conversation in a slightly different direction. He leaned in a little closer, his curiosity piqued. All right, so all this talk about being grounded and staying calm. I've got to ask, is there maybe something people don't know about you, that's been a big influence on how you approach life? I mean, you're one of the most down-to-earth guys in Hollywood, and you're always talking about kindness. What shaped that? Keanu took another brief pause, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't quick to speak, but when he did, it was like his words had a weight to them, as if they'd been carefully considered over time. There's a lot of things that shape you, I guess, he began. I grew up in different places, around different people. I didn't have an easy childhood, but I was lucky enough to meet people along the way who showed me that kindness really does matter. It's the little things, you know? Just showing up for people, being there when they need you, listening when they talk, that kind of thing. It's not about doing big grand gestures. It's just about being a good person when it counts. The way Keanu spoke made everything sound so simple, and yet, it felt like the kind of wisdom you could spend years trying to figure out. His humility was refreshing, especially for someone who could easily be caught up in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. He didn't seem to want to stand out for his success. Instead, it was like he wanted to stand out for something else, something deeper. Jimmy, still processing the shift in the conversation, nodded slowly. That's really something, he said, his voice almost quieter than usual. I think sometimes we forget that. It's easy to get lost in the big stuff, money, fame, success. But you're right. It's the little things that really make a difference. Keanu smiled slightly, as though he was glad to see Jimmy understanding where he was coming from. Yeah, he said. I mean, when you're around long enough, you start to realize that it's not about what you have. It's about how you treat people. That's what sticks with you in the end. For a moment, there was a calm that fell over the whole studio. Even the audience, who was used to the fast-paced energy of the show, seemed to feel the change. The lights were still bright, the music still played in the background, but there was something different in the air. Jimmy took a deep breath and glanced around, trying to figure out how to keep the conversation light again, but he couldn't help himself. There was something about Keanu's words that kept drawing him back in, pulling him into this deeper way of thinking. He leaned forward once again, his tone more serious than it had been before. You know, Jimmy began, his voice slower now. I think a lot of people come on this show, and they want to tell their stories, talk about their movies, maybe even share some funny behind-the-scenes stuff. But you're sharing something way different. It's like you're reminding all of us what really matters. Keanu shrugged as if he didn't think he was doing anything extraordinary. I don't think it's that complicated, he said. I'm just sharing what I've learned. We all have our struggles and we all have our strengths. But at the end of the day, it's about the people around you and how you make them feel. That's what I try to focus on. Jimmy smiled, looking out at the audience for a moment before glancing back at Keanu. He had been known for his humor, for being quick-witted and full of energy. But in that moment, he wasn't trying to crack jokes or make people laugh. He was just listening. He could feel the weight of the conversation, and for once he wasn't rushing to fill the silence with jokes. He just wanted to hear what Keanu had to say. And Keanu? He kept it simple. He kept it real. There was no agenda, no need to impress anyone. He was just himself, and that was something that spoke louder than anything else. The interview continued from there, but there was a different energy in the room now. The lighthearted banter returned, but there was always this underlying sense of respect, of reflection that lingered in the background. It was a rare moment when you could see a celebrity being fully, genuinely themselves. And for Jimmy, that moment would stick with him long after the camera stopped rolling. Keanu had reminded him, and everyone watching, of something simple yet important. That kindness, in all its quiet forms, could change everything. As the interview continued, the conversation seemed to flow more naturally, but something had changed in the room. What started as a regular late-night talk show segment had transformed into something much more intimate, a space where the audience and even Jimmy could reflect on things they'd never really considered before. It was as if Keanu had quietly pulled the curtain back on the world, allowing everyone to peek into a simpler yet deeper way of living. For the first time in a long while, Jimmy found himself struggling to steer the conversation in the usual direction. The lighthearted jokes and quick banter that typically filled the space between questions were there, of course. But they felt almost trivial compared to the calm, reflective energy that Keanu had brought to the table. Still, Jimmy was Jimmy. He wasn't going to let the moment slip away without trying to bring some of the old fun back into it. He flashed a grin and turned to Keanu, his eyes twinkling with the familiar mischief that had made him a beloved host for years. "So," Jimmy started, leaning in slightly with a playful look on his face. "We've talked about kindness and living simply, but let's get into the fun stuff now. I mean, everyone knows you for your roles in some of the most action-packed movies ever. The Matrix, John Wick, all that gun-fu, right? But I gotta ask, when you're not saving the world, what's your idea of a perfect day?" Keanu, whose expression had remained thoughtful and almost otherworldly throughout the interview, broke into a small smile at the mention of his iconic action roles. It was a soft smile, the kind you might see from someone who was not only at peace with their own success but who also understood that these roles, while memorable, were just a part of the bigger picture. "Well, it's pretty simple, actually," Keanu replied with a shrug, his voice calm. "A perfect day for me is just being at home, doing something that makes me feel connected. Whether that's reading, going for a walk, spending time with friends, or just sitting quietly for a while. I think being able to take a breath and be in the moment is a pretty great thing." The way Keanu said it, there was no hint of trying to impress anyone. It wasn't a rehearsed answer, just a sincere response that felt as natural as his calm demeanor. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully, clearly enjoying the contrast between the high-octane world Keanu often portrayed on screen and the serene reality he seemed to embrace in real life. "That sounds pretty amazing," Jimmy said, smiling as he leaned back in his chair. "I think we could all use a little more of that. I mean, I don't know about you, but my life's a little more chaotic, you know?" The crowd chuckled in agreement. Jimmy had a way of turning his own busy, hectic lifestyle into a funny observation, but in that moment, even his self-deprecating humor couldn't distract from the underlying message that Keanu had planted in their minds. Slowing down and appreciating the small moments could be just as important as any big achievement. Jimmy gave a light laugh before continuing. "I mean, with all the crazy schedules and constant running around, I sometimes forget to just, well, breathe." He leaned in again, looking at Keanu with a knowing grin. "But hey, I'm sure I could learn a thing or two from you." Keanu gave a soft laugh in return, his gaze steady. "It's not about perfection," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "It's about making space for yourself, whatever that means for you. It's not always easy to do, but it's important." The crowd was listening closely now, hanging on every word. For a show that was usually filled with laughter and playful banter, the tone had shifted to something deeper, something meaningful. People were connecting not just to the words Keanu was saying, but to the way he was saying them, as though he had mastered the art of slowing down long before the rest of the world had caught up. Jimmy nodded in agreement. though there was a hint of playful sarcasm in his voice. "Well, now I feel like I should go meditate or something," he said, raising his hands as if pretending to find his zen. The crowd laughed, enjoying the lightheartedness. But there was no denying that Keanu's influence had turned the conversation into something far more reflective than anyone had expected. Keanu, ever the calming presence, smiled at Jimmy's antics but didn't let the moment slip away. "Meditation, yoga, a walk in nature. It doesn't matter what you call it," he said. "It's just about finding that stillness even for a few minutes in your day. That's what helps." Jimmy, his humor still intact but now with a thoughtful edge, sat back in his chair. He seemed to be genuinely considering what Keanu had said, more so than any of the playful questions he'd asked earlier. "You know, I think I need to take that advice seriously. Maybe I'll start walking around the block every morning before I get into the madness of the show. Who knows? Maybe I'll turn into a Zen master or something." The crowd laughed again, but there was an understanding in their laughter. They knew Jimmy was joking, but there was truth in what he was saying. Everyone had something in their life that could benefit from a little more stillness, a little more space to just breathe. Keanu, however, didn't respond with another joke or comment. He simply nodded in agreement, as though he understood exactly where Jimmy was coming from. The conversation flowed into more familiar territory for a moment, with Jimmy asking about Keanu's upcoming projects and teasing him about his action hero persona. But even in those light-hearted exchanges, there was an underlying respect that had grown between them. Keanu's words had opened up a new perspective, one that neither Jimmy nor the audience had expected, and it was clear that even in the midst of their usual late-night fun, something had shifted. The interview carried on for a while longer, but by now the tone had remained steady. There were still laughs, still moments of playful back and forth, but they felt different. They felt like they were happening in the shadow of something deeper, and as the final segment of the show drew near, Jimmy leaned forward again, giving Keanu one last look of genuine curiosity. "All right, Keanu," he said, his voice soft but filled with warmth. "You've shared a lot of wisdom tonight, so I've got to ask. If you could go back and tell your younger self one thing, just one piece of advice, what would it be?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I'd tell him not to be afraid to be himself, to trust that he's enough just as he is." The simplicity of the answer hung in the air for a moment, and Jimmy could feel the power in those words. It wasn't a flashy answer. It wasn't something that could be packaged into a soundbite for social media. It was just pure honesty, a quiet reminder that we are all enough just as we are. Jimmy smiled, a little stunned by how deeply the conversation had gone. "I think we all needed to hear that tonight," he said, his voice sincere. The audience, too, seemed to agree. They had laughed, they had reflected, and now they were taking away something from the night that would likely stay with them for a long time. As the show wrapped up and the credits began to roll, the energy in the room felt different than it had at the start of the evening. It wasn't just another celebrity interview. It was something more, a moment of connection, a reminder of what truly mattered. Keanu stood up to leave, his quiet smile never wavering. He didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone had spoken volumes. As he walked off the stage, the audience erupted into applause. But the usual loud cheers were softer this time, almost reverent. Jimmy watched him go, still processing everything that had unfolded in those last few minutes. It wasn't just another night. It had been a reminder that sometimes the simplest answers are the most profound, and that was the kind of wisdom that could change everything. As the applause slowly faded, the lights on the set dimmed a little, signaling the end of the show. But the energy in the room still buzzed with something deeper. There was no denying that Keanu's visit had left a mark. Jimmy, as always, had his playful side, but tonight had been different. The conversation had ventured into territory that both he and the audience didn't expect. It was as though they'd all experienced a quiet shift in perspective, one that wasn't about fame, success, or the usual glitz and glamour, but about something more fundamental: kindness, being present, and embracing simplicity. As the final commercial break played, Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with all the things he had just heard. He glanced toward the production team who were wrapping up their tasks, but his thoughts were still with Keanu. How had he managed to change the tone of the entire show without even trying? It was a mystery, but it was one that Jimmy was glad to have experienced. During the break, Jimmy turned to his team with a wry smile. "Well, that was Unexpected, he said, chuckling. One of the crew members, a longtime producer, laughed along with him. That's one way to put it. I've never seen the audience that quiet before. It was like everyone was just listening. Yeah, Jimmy agreed, his tone thoughtful. It wasn't just the usual talk show stuff. It felt like we all got a little reminder about what really matters. His producer nodded, clearly still caught up in the weight of the conversation. It's funny, isn't it? How someone can be in Hollywood, do all these big blockbuster movies and still be so down to earth. He makes you rethink a lot of things. Jimmy thought about that for a moment, then sighed. You know, we get caught up in all this stuff. Movies, fame, the next big project, and sometimes it's easy to forget the small stuff. The little things that make a difference. I think I needed to hear that tonight. The commercial break ended and Jimmy was back in his chair, ready to finish the show. The camera light blinked on and his usual energy returned. But this time there was a subtle change in him. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. Something had shifted. As the credits rolled and the final moments of the show unfolded, Jimmy took a second to look at the audience. He realized that in a way they were all on the same journey tonight. They had all experienced something unexpected, something profound, and for once it wasn't about the usual laugh lines or celebrity gossip. It was about a reminder. Sometimes we need to slow down, reflect, and simply be kind. When the lights finally turned off and the show ended, Jimmy stood up from his desk, stretching his arms and letting out a small sigh. He felt different, more grounded than he had in a long time. As he walked off the stage, his mind wandered back to Keanu's words. He could still see Keanu's face calm and steady, like he had all the time in the world. There was something infectious about that energy, something that made you want to slow down and take a breath. The crew started packing up, and Jimmy made his way to his dressing room. He needed a moment to reflect on what had just happened. As he sat down, he pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, typing out a few things that had stuck with him from the conversation. He knew he wasn't just going to forget this night. The words Keanu had shared weren't just fleeting bits of wisdom. They had hit Jimmy at a deeper level, one that had nothing to do with fame or comedy. They had reminded him of the importance of human connection, kindness, and above all, taking a step back when life became too overwhelming. Meanwhile, outside the studio, Keanu was preparing to leave. His quiet, reflective demeanor hadn't changed since the moment he walked onto the set. There was no rush, no frantic hurry to move on to the next thing. He simply gathered his things, thanked the staff, and made his way out. There was something calming about how he carried himself, almost like he knew that life didn't need to be rushed. He had mastered the art of being present, of making each moment count. As Keanu stepped out of the building and into the night, he felt the usual quiet joy of knowing that he had shared something meaningful with others. It wasn't about the fame, the interviews, or the applause. It was about the opportunity to connect even for a moment in a way that felt real. He had no idea how much his words had impacted Jimmy or the audience, but it didn't matter. He wasn't in it for recognition. He was in it because for a brief time he had reminded people of something that was easy to forget, the power of being kind and present. Back in the studio, Jimmy sat in his dressing room for a while longer, thinking about everything Keanu had said. His mind kept coming back to the idea of kindness. It wasn't a new concept for him, of course. He'd heard it a million times before. But there was something different about the way Keanu had framed it, something that made it feel more like a way of life than just a passing thought. He found himself reflecting on his own actions. How often did he really stop to think about how his actions affected others? Did he take the time to listen when someone needed him? Or was he always so focused on the next joke, the next show? Keanu had shown him that there was a balance to be found between doing the big things and being there for the small moments. And that, in the end, was what made life meaningful. As the night wore on, Jimmy decided he wanted to take this lesson with him. He wasn't sure exactly how it would change things, but he knew that it had to. Maybe it would be small changes at first. Slowing down when things felt too hectic, taking more time to appreciate the people around him, or simply being more present in his everyday life. It wasn't going to be easy. Life was always moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and sometimes it was hard to pause. But if Keanu could do it, maybe it was something worth trying. The next morning, as Jimmy started his day, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He decided to take a few minutes before the show started to just breathe, to sit quietly and reflect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had no idea where this new approach would take him, but he felt a little more centered, a little more grounded than before. And that felt like enough for now. As for Keanu, he continued his own quiet journey, unaffected by the spotlight or the attention. For him, it wasn't about changing the world in grand gestures. It was about making small, meaningful connections with the people around him, sharing kindness in whatever way he could. He wasn't trying to be a guru or a teacher. He was just living his life, one small act of kindness at a time, and hoping that maybe, just maybe, others would follow suit. The ripple effect of that night on Jimmy's show was far from over. Though Keanu had left the stage, his words had stayed with everyone who had witnessed the interview. In the days that followed, Jimmy found himself thinking back to that conversation often. And for the first time in a long time, he felt more connected to his audience. Not just through laughter and jokes, but through something deeper, something that transcended entertainment. Keanu had made an impact, not with grand gestures or flashy moves, but with the simple, quiet truth of his words, and that was more than enough. The weeks that followed Keanu's appearance on the show were different for Jimmy. It wasn't just about the typical whirlwind of preparing for new episodes or the usual antics. There was a quieter, more reflective energy that had settled in his life. The change wasn't something he had forced. It had simply emerged, as though Keanu's words had planted a seed that he hadn't realized needed to be planted. Jimmy had always been someone who could joke around, who could keep the show lighthearted, and who could keep the audience laughing. But after that night, he started to realize that maybe there was more to his job than just making people laugh. Maybe he could bring something more meaningful to his audience. Every morning before the chaos of the show started, Jimmy would take a few minutes to center himself. He would sit in silence for just 5 minutes, allowing his thoughts to settle before the flood of questions and rehearsals began. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At first, it felt awkward. Jimmy was used to rushing through his day, jumping from one task to the next. But slowly, those 5 minutes began to feel like an essential part of his routine. He wasn't meditating in the traditional sense. He wasn't trying to become a monk. But the practice of slowing down, even for just a short time, helped him feel more present. He found himself carrying that sense of presence with him throughout the day, taking a moment to truly listen to people when they spoke to him, instead of rushing through conversations like he had before. He started noticing the little things more. How his crew members greeted him in the morning, how his guests interacted with him, the small gestures that had once gone unnoticed. It was as if Keanu's message had opened his eyes to the importance of these moments. The world didn't have to move at breakneck speed all the time. Life could still be rich and fulfilling, even in the quieter, simpler moments. Jimmy found himself using that energy in the show as well. He didn't stop being funny or lighthearted, but he started adding more thoughtful pauses into his conversations. He'd ask his guests about their lives beyond their latest projects. He'd ask them what they were passionate about, what truly mattered to them. The result? The interviews felt more authentic. The audience, too, seemed to appreciate the shift. They could feel that Jimmy wasn't just playing a role anymore. He was engaging in real conversations with people, allowing them to share more of themselves. It was an unexpected change, but it was a welcome one. Even his team noticed the difference. During meetings, they often caught themselves pausing a little longer before jumping into the next topic, just like Jimmy did. There was a newfound sense of appreciation for the present moment, and it was spreading to everyone involved in the show. One evening, as Jimmy was wrapping up the day's filming, he received a message from his producer, letting him know that they had received feedback from the audience. It was something they did regularly, but this time it was different. The messages were more personal. Viewers had shared how much the Keanu episode had impacted them. They talked about how it had made them think more about their own lives, how they had felt inspired to slow down, to be kinder, to pay more attention to the people around them. One message in particular stood out. A viewer wrote about how they had been feeling overwhelmed by the demands of their life. They were working long hours trying to juggle a family, and had just been running on autopilot. After watching Keanu's interview, they had taken a step back and decided to change their approach. They started setting aside time each day to do something just for themselves, whether it was reading, taking a walk, or simply sitting in silence for a few minutes. The message ended with a note of gratitude, thanking the show for helping them see the importance of slowing down. Jimmy read the message with a quiet smile. It was a reminder that sometimes just one conversation could make a difference. It wasn't about doing anything flashy. It wasn't about trying to change the world in a grand way. It was about taking small steps to be more present and kinder. And those small steps, collectively, could lead to big changes. As the weeks turned into months, Jimmy continued to find ways to integrate what he had learned from that night. He didn't need to announce it to the world. He didn't need to make a big deal about it. The changes were subtle, but they were there. He felt more connected to his work, more connected to the people around him, and, most importantly, more connected to himself. And then one evening, as the show was wrapping up, Jimmy found himself backstage once again. In a quiet moment before the show's credits rolled, he thought back to that night with Keanu, the quiet wisdom he had shared, the simple truths that had resonated so deeply with everyone. He had no idea how much his words had impacted others, but Jimmy knew that they had done something significant for him. He reached for his phone and sent Keanu a simple text message. It wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't even a thank you exactly. It was just a message that came straight from his heart. Hey, just wanted to let you know that you really changed the way I look at things. You made me slow down, and for that I'm really grateful. Thank you for that. He paused for a moment, then hit send. A minute later, his phone buzzed with a response. I'm glad to hear that. Take care of yourself. It was a short reply, but it was exactly what Jimmy needed. No grand speeches, no need for anything more. Just a simple acknowledgement that the message had been received and understood. Jimmy put his phone down, feeling a little lighter. It was funny how one conversation one night could have such a lasting effect. He had always believed in the power of humor to bring people together, but now he realized that the power of silence, of listening, and of kindness could be just as powerful. As the lights dimmed on the set for the final time that night, Jimmy felt a sense of peace. The show had been a success as usual, but tonight it wasn't the usual laughter and applause that lingered in his mind. It was the quiet moments, the reflections that had followed Keanu's visit. And in the midst of it all, Jimmy realized that this journey wasn't just about entertaining others. It was about finding ways to be a better version of himself and sharing that journey with his audience in whatever small way he could. Keanu's message wasn't something that could be easily packaged or sold. It wasn't a quick fix or a trend. It was a reminder of what it meant to live authentically, to be present and to be kind. It was a message that could change lives, one small step at a time. And so, as the final credits rolled and the show came to an end, Jimmy knew that this wasn't just another episode. This was something bigger. It was a moment of connection, a moment of reflection, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply be there, really be there, for the people around you, for yourself and for the world. As for Keanu, he likely had no idea the ripple effect he'd created that night. He wasn't in it for recognition or fame. But the truth was he had changed something for the better in the lives of many, simply by being himself. And that in the end was the greatest gift of all.